Good evening. I want to begin by thanking all of you for being here and extending some further thanks. First of all, to Omar and Leslie for the invitation to give this lecture this evening. To all of the participants of this year's At Land's Edge seminar, with whom much of the thinking around archives that I'll be talking about tonight was thought in community with. To our community partners, At Land's Edge community partners, the Southern California Library, in particular, Youssef Omawale and Michelle Welsing. Blue, who gives me the few hours that I need every day to continue my work, and to my partner Camilo Ontiveros, whose support is the only reason why I'm up here with you all today. So I'd also like to take a moment to honor and thank the Lenape people, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Manhattan, and on whose land we as settlers are gathering today. So my lecture is entitled Archival Futurism, Memory and the Ruins of Imperialism. Thank you. Is the sound okay? Yep, okay. And I'm using this lecture as an opportunity to think through one of my most recent projects, which was just mounted at the Los Angeles Municipal Art Gallery, and which is entitled The Archives Fold. And I'm going to be offering context and process for how I arrived at this latest project. I'm going to both walk you through, research I've done for the past 2 decades, as well as a few projects here and there that I feel resonate very strongly and have led me to this point. And at the end, I'm going to offer a brief excerpt of the Archives Fold for you, a reading of a text alongside the images that are within the project. But to begin, I wanted to give you a kind of visual overview of what it looks like installed. And it's a multi-image slide and sound installation. In one room, which is a kind of long and narrow room, there are 10 slide projections. This is what you see in this image. And most of the images that are in that room are from archives, mainly from DC colonial archives, such as the National Archive or the Library of Congress, where I was delving into colonial representations of the Philippines, from the turn of the century up until independence, which was the mid-1940s. And this is a kind of view of the slide projections, is the 10 slide projections that are projecting images into that room. And in a second room are images of both space and photographs from my family's archives that are projected as a one image slide projection alongside a light table of slides, many of which come from the National Library in the Philippines and index a different moment, I would say, of a kind of Philippine modernity post-1950s. And 2 texts which organize the work. So I'm going to go more deeper with you into how this project is organized, but I wanted to kind of give you this visual as a kind of cue or something that makes you think about how all of this research will actually lead up to this excerpt that I'm going to share with you at a later moment of my talk. So One of the themes that I think has preoccupied me in my practice has been a question about generations. This is an image of my grandmother. She was quite young here, probably, I would say, in her 20s. An image of my mother when she was still a baby. An image of my mother with, I'm not sure who, but in the water of the Rio Grande, in the town that we're from, Cotabato City, which is on the island of Mindanao in the Philippines. An image of my grandmother, my aunt, and my mother in Manila. The dress kind of tells you the era of the 60s. An image of me as a baby with my mother, and now we are in Los Angeles. And an image of me and my mother and my grandmother at the mall in Culver City, California, where I grew up. So, I begin with these very personal images from our family archive because I think that they ground you in both the question of generations that has preoccupied my work, but also the question of intimacy. And, by intimacy, I think we often think about, spaces of love, affection, care. But I would also say that within intimacy is also a space where the affective dimension of politics really takes hold, and also where some of the most difficult violences are felt in our lives, whether they be, at an interpersonal level with those whom we love, or again, at a more structural level where, the kinds of larger systems in which we are participating in find their place in our lives. So these are pictures of the apartment where I grew up, the living room. I think this was probably around the time when I was 3, because I see the little picture on top of the television. It was quite a wallpaper that ornamented our kitchen. This was my parents' room. And this was the bedroom that I shared with my grandmother. And for me, looking at these images is quite a, I feel very overwhelmed by memories. I'm sure, any of us in the room who have pictures of our childhood feel the same way. In these images is, in a way, all of the time that came before and after the image. And, for me, when I think about this apartment where I grew up, it was a site of really witnessing a whole saga of immigration that characterized my childhood. We were able to migrate to the United States because my father had worked both for the U.S. Embassy and for the U.S. military in Okinawa. And that's the result of a whole colonial legacy there. But at any rate, my father and mother met in Manila and, would migrate to Los Angeles. And after their migration, the whole plan was to try to get the rest of my mother's family to migrate. And for anyone who has tried to migrate legally, that process in terms of administrative forms that one needs to fill out and the waiting period that one needs to go through is quite arduous. And part of that whole plan of the migration of my mother's family was to get my grandmother to first migrate so that she would be the one who would be able to petition my mother's brothers and sisters over, because the time span of a brother-sister, petition is much, much longer than a mother-son or mother-daughter petition. And so that was the experience that, really I feel characterized my childhood, and alongside the eventual arrival of my mother's brothers and sisters, many of whom, really lived their lives with this migration in mind. For example, if one were to marry, that would actually delay one's ability to migrate by another 20 years versus if you stayed single. So my uncles stayed single in order to be able to have this shortened period of time to be able to migrate. And this apartment that I'm showing you was eventually filled with, 10 people at one time. It was a very small 2-bedroom apartment. And so we were all, living on top of each other. And, some of my earliest childhood memories are of, I think, really witnessing the trauma of that migration for this generation that preceded me. In that bedroom, I would watch my grandmother, who absolutely hated the United States, and that would come across at every moment of her waking time. She would utter under her breath at every moment that it was cold, that everything was stupid, that everything was dirty, and her way of surviving this migration was by sewing and crocheting. And that's what I would see her do. That was also the way, pretty much the only way that we related. She spoke dialect from the area that she's from called Maguindanao. I spoke English and understood Tagalog, but didn't speak her dialect. And so, this was kind of the way we related. Like, I would walk with her to House of Fabrics to buy material that she would sew, or she taught me how to crochet, which I don't remember anymore. I wish that I did. But she would make things like this. And this is something that I found, in my linen closet recently. And it was around the time when I was doing all kinds of archival research, which I'll go into more description of and more background of at a later moment. But, it really made me start understanding the kind of memory that this object held, because, this whole story that I just unfolded for you comes out of this, experience of seeing these pillowcases again. And it was only through this research into colonial imagery of the Philippines done during the occupation that I came across the fact that embroidery, crocheting were actually colonial knowledges. The United States had set up schools for women in the Philippines to learn how to embroider and how to crochet, which totally put these pillowcases in a different light for me, because not only were they now, this whole experience of immigration that I shared with you a moment ago, that I felt in this 2-bedroom apartment in Culver City, California, but actually that that these pillowcases also had this whole colonial legacy, which for me sits in a kind of historical tension with the kind of resilience or survivance, I would say, that I shared with you in terms of how I interpreted how how my grandmother was able to endure her migration through this practice. And I want to think about these, something like this pillowcase, alongside, the experience that we have when we do enter into more institutionalized archives, where the documents that we're looking at are often in folders like this. I would say that, when documents end up in folders like this, they've already gone through a whole process and a whole entry into the politics of the archive. First and foremost, in order to enter into an archival box like this, someone, likely the archivist, had to make a decision about what was important to include in that box and what was not important to include in the box. And of course, even that moment of archivization has a whole backstory, right, about what does and what does not end up at that in that archivist's hands, what documents exist that might be deemed worthy to be stored. And this is something that the philosopher Achille Mbembe writes about in an essay called The Power of Archives and Its Limits. And he writes about how this kind of politics of archivization sheds light on the fact that archives, perhaps first and foremost, are about status. Because involved in that deciding of what is and is not important to include in an archive is also power. The power of an institution, of power of a person who works in the institution to make those kinds of decisions. And likely all of the questions of power that enter into who can and who cannot access those institutionalized archives, alongside all of the ways in which archivists and historians oftentimes serve as functions of the state insofar as the ways in which that practice of archivization takes place. Mbembe also opens up a question of temporality within the archive. He writes, "Through archived documents, we are presented with pieces of time to be assembled, fragments of life to be placed in order, one after the other, in an attempt to formulate a story that acquires its coherence through the ability to craft links between the beginning and the end. A montage of fragments thus creates an illusion of totality and continuity. In this way, just like the architectural process, the time woven together by the archive is a product of a composition." So I guess there are a few things that I'd like to underscore in this passage. First, that there's always a kind of writing that's taking place in piecing together these fragments within an archive. And obviously, these fragments within an archive, when that piecing together is taking place, it's telling a story that serves one ideology or another. And I think that, these questions about how you piece together an illusion of totality or continuity, how you tell a story from fragments, is a particularly important one for anyone who comes from an oppressed background. because part and parcel of coming from an oppressed background is having the experience of living a life that has been fragmented by the violence of that oppression. And part and parcel of that experience of oppression comes with the question of what has been able to survive that oppression, whether it's the bare life of actually being able to endure the violence of that oppression, or the material culture that exists as a kind of index of those lives lived. And for me, this has been such a dominant question in every aspect of my life. A lot of what I'm going to be sharing with you in the upcoming, time of our evening together is more of the archivally based research practice that I have. But there's a whole other aspect of my practice that is about community building. So for example, Leslie mentioned At Land's Edge, which is an autonomous decolonial educational platform that I founded in 2015, really as a response to the forms of white supremacy that exists within arts and cultural institutional contexts. And this year, we partnered with a community-based library and archive called the Southern California Library in Los Angeles, which is a space, a very rare space, where the histories of radical social movements in Los Angeles are housed. Even that space has its own politics of archivization, but its central focus is on radical social movements, and because of, I think, that fact, they are really operating in a bare bones kind of way, where one of the central tenets of most institutionalized archives is about preservation. But preservation takes a lot of money. So for a community-based archive like the Southern California Library, preservation is actually one of the first things that goes out of the window in terms of their archival practice. Rather than focus their energy on preservation, they actually focus their energy on access. And so the archive becomes a site where local organizing takes place, where anyone from off the street can actually come in and look at the documents and boxes that they have, as opposed to what happens in a lot of institutionalized archives, which is that you have to have a certain pedigree to enter. So before anything, I want to situate you in the history of U.S. colonization in the Philippines. And this is a map that shows you the territorial growth of the United States from 1783 up to 1850. And this is a map of Western expansion. This is also a map about genocide, the genocide of Native Americans. But that westward expansion didn't stop at the western edge of the United States. It actually continued across the Pacific, with Hawaii being annexed in 1898, the Midway Islands in 1867, the Wake Islands in 1899, Guam in 1898, and the Philippines in 1898. And the form of imperialism that the Philippines experienced at the turn of the 20th century with the US occupation is one that has many links with what happened to Native Americans on US, kind of mainland US soil. Many of the soldiers who actually committed those violences and that genocide on mainland US soil were the same ones who went to the Philippine Islands. And that's something that I'm going to expand upon in some of the images to come. So perhaps it's also helpful to have a working understanding of imperialism between us all tonight. And Linda Tuway-Smith, who has a very thoughtful book called Decolonizing Methodologies, writes that there are 4 layers of imperialism, and these 4 layers aren't in opposition to each other. They're actually, part of this larger epic process. So she writes, imperialism tends to be used in at least 4 different ways when describing the form of European imperialism which started in the 15th century. First, imperialism as economic expansion. Second, imperialism as a subjugation of others. Third, imperialism as an idea or spirit with many forms of realization, and one of those forms of realization would be colonization. And fourth, imperialism as a discursive field of knowledge. So I think it's helpful to begin here because, as Edward Said writes about in Culture and Imperialism, empire always needed its ideas in order to take hold. And when Linda Tuway-Smith is describing imperialism not only as economic expansion, but also as an idea or as a discursive field of knowledge, it opens up this question of the ideas that empire needs in order to take hold and the kinds of representations, right, that are a part of that ideology. And that's really central to our discussion this evening because, at the center, I think what I'm going to be unpacking is a question about the visuality of imperialism. So when I was a student, an undergraduate, like many of you in the room, I happened upon a book at the UC Berkeley Archives, the Bancroft Library, that was called Our New Possessions in the Philippine Islands, published in 1914, with photographs by a photographer based in the Presidio named J.D. Givens. And in this volume, which I think has had a huge impact on me and which has really influenced all of my practice since that time, I learned about the kinds of discursive constructions or the kinds of the way in which a certain knowledge about the Philippines was being communicated to the mainland US for popular consumption, because this is what this book was intended for. And images like this were in that book, Lepers in the Philippines, and I was very interested in this work that was taking place across the image and the text. Image and text is always a relation of power. You look at any newspaper and you understand that there's a way in which the text that is accompanying any image is actually anchoring the meaning of that image more often than not within a particular ideology. And there's no doubt that there's that work that's being done within the image-text relationship in this volume. But there's also a kind of production of knowledge, right? A kind of typology of forms that's taking place in this volume when it moves from lepers in the Philippines to Filipino children to Tagalog family. This is one where there's a kind of racist humor involved. Mr. Dam and his whole damn family in the PI. And Twixt Beano and Love. And I want to pause here for a moment because, I think that this image of a U.S. soldier with a Filipina, for me, is one that, really opened up this question about the gendered violence of occupation. Not only as it took place in relation to, this idea of the Filipina woman as a site of sexual availability, which I'll go into further with other examples in a moment, but also the way that it portrayed the Filipino man as a site to be killed and sodomized, which is what this next image shows, which is entitled Father and Son, where the son is posed on the ground with his pants off and a stick placed on his buttocks. So the way in which the gendered violence of colonialism within the Philippines played upon both the body of the woman and the man is one that I think has another, partner in this image, which was also included in the volume, and which is the only image in the whole volume where male and female, gendered male and female, were placed together on one page, but it was a young girl and a little man. And this brings me into maybe an expansion of the question about generations with which I began. Because part of the US colonial project was very much invested in cutting off future generations. Around the time of this volume, there was a mandate by the US military to kill any boy over the age of 10 because they had a memory of a time before US occupation. So how it is that memory and generations have been so central to my practice, I ground in this colonial legacy. And with my research, in the subsequent many years after that initial encounter with this volume in the library as an undergraduate, I would find that these images of death were not isolated to this image in this volume of photographs, but were actually a big part of the visual practice of US occupation in the Philippines. Stereographs, which, as many of you probably know, are meant to be viewed in an apparatus where the two images through the apparatus become 3D. The two images come into 3 dimensions with this viewing apparatus. But dead Filipinos on the battlefield near Malabon, Philippines, this was meant to enter into 3 dimensions for a U.S. public. This is a blurry slide, sorry, but this is like it says I think a tribute to Aguinaldo's ambition. So not only, was I finding these more popular images of dead Filipinos, but actually, also images that were within, for internal circulation. At the National Archive, there's a collection from the Bureau of Insular Affairs, which was the governing body of the Philippines from 1900 to 1939, and where a very vast photographic, with extensive documentation of the Philippines, everything from flora and fauna, infrastructure, racial types, the insurrection, blah blah blah, could be found, and so those that kind of will to knowledge through photography contained other images of the battlefield, like this one. But I was particularly struck by these ones that were more for popular circulation, or many images where there were skulls and crossbones, cemeteries, really, placing Filipino children in relation to death. So, in thinking about this moment of U.S. colonial occupation and the kind of violence that existed there, I've been very influenced by the work of Saidiya Hartman, and in particular an essay that as I understand it, has been spoken of by other speakers in these series, that's called Venus in Two Acts. And, Hartman writes, "How does one recuperate lives entangled with and impossible to differentiate from the terrible utterances that condemned them to death, the account books that identified them as units of value, the invoices that claimed them as property, and the banal chronicles that stripped them of human features?" And in particular, Saidiya Hartman is working with archives of slavery, and the utter loss and silence that exists there, because there's not a single account that currently exists of an enslaved woman who survived the Middle Passage. And her attempt to deal with that silence alongside the fact that the archives that she's looking at are always coming from the slave holder's perspective. And her desire to open up a space for the voices and experiences lived by the women who survived the Middle Passage brings her to what I think is a really profound methodology, a kind of tarrying with and against the archive. She writes, "As a writer committed to telling stories, I've endeavored to represent the lives of the nameless and the forgotten, to reckon with loss, and to respect the limits of what cannot be known. For me, narrating counter-histories of slavery has always been inseparable from writing a history of the present, by which I mean the incomplete project of freedom and the precarious life of the ex-slave, a condition defined by the vulnerability to premature death and to gratuitous acts of violence. As I understand it, a history of the present strives to illuminate the intimacy of our experience with the lives of the dead, to write our now as it is interrupted by this past, and to imagine a free state, not as a time before captivity or slavery, but rather as the anticipated future of this writing." So Hartman opens up a very, very profound question of temporality for us here, where to do a archival work, to look at the past, has everything to do with the future. And this is because we don't look at history in the present because it's over and done with. We look at history in the present because these conditions continue into the present. And the future, or the horizon of that practice, of that historical work, is always oriented toward liberation. So, coming back to the kinds of turn of the century popular images that circulated about the Philippines in the United States, I'm struck by an image like this, where the Filipina woman is trapped between the soldiers in the background who are looking at the camera, and the camera I guess on the other side of the image, photographing the Filipinas. And I think in my practice, I've really been trying to ask myself how it's possible to get out of that trap. And I think that trap means many things. That trap is not only a question about representation. In other words, what is image within the frame? But it's also about how it is that one listens for all of the silences and that which exists outside of the frame. Because as the visual theorist Jolene Rickard has talked about it, a photograph is just a piece of tape. It holds together two worlds. And whatever the discourse is that wants to write the other or the colonized within an imperialist logic, on the other side of that piece of tape, our life world so much more expansive than anything that logic of colonial ideology and supremacy could ever account for. And for me, that has been what the challenge is. How do you make space for all of those cosmologies and ways of being in the world that exceed that representation by the West? I think there's also a challenge of audiences. So I've been showing you a lot of images from this colonial period meant to circulate either within, the forms of governance as a kind of tallying of the colony, or for popular circulation within the United States. But what happens when those are not the audiences for which one makes? What happens when you no longer make work for the West? What happens when you make work for your grandmother, for your daughter? What happens when you make work for another group that has been oppressed in similar ways? It has similar histories of colonization that might share, a lot of these both experiences of oppression, but forms of survival. So, I think that the kind of logic of this loop of critiquing empire, but having that fold back into, work that is made for those who are within empire is something that has been like an ongoing challenge that I've posed to myself in my work. You know, this is just a recording, which I'm not going to actually play for you right now, but this is from the mid-40s, Second World War. It's called Filipino Baby. It's a song where photography and the image of the Filipino woman as a site of sexual availability continues. And you know, I present it just as a kind of link between, you know, this more turn of the century representation, you know, this mid-1940s representation, which is also, you know, around the time of Philippine independence, which I would say is actually an ongoing entry into a kind of neo-colonial moment. And, you know, a project that I made in 2015 that was called Basing Landscapes, where the ruins of former US bases in the island of Luzon, which is the island of the north in the Philippines, were set against the voices of women, some of whom had worked as prostitutes during the time of the US bases, and some of whom are currently environmental activists trying to bring attention to the high levels of toxicity that were left by the bases since their departure in 1992, and which have affected the communities that exist there until the present moment. Illnesses, birth defects, and so, you know, the piece was kind of constructed as this back and forth between, you know, these landscapes that extended outward from not only, you know, the military base, but to the voices of these women. This was the, you know, former cinema in the base. And ultimately ending up in the landscapes of the adjacent volcano, Mount Pinatubo, which actually has a nice place in this story about liberation from US occupation, because, you know, in 1991, the Philippine Senate had rejected the extension of US bases on Philippine soil. But the US wouldn't leave. And it took this volcano, which had been dormant for 600 years, to explode for the US to finally leave their bases. And so this kind of force of the land, you know, is one that, you know, in this other cosmological way I'm very interested in, and I'll expand upon that again in this most recent project, the Archives Fold, which I'll be sharing with you. But also a lot of the images that fill this video are of water, and the way that water moves through this volcanic landscape and carves a different story of the land and its inhabitants, opens up a different idea of landscape, right, apart from the Western eye, in which the landscape is one to actually, you know, behold in one's mastery. This is a landscape instead about voices, about the people who inhabit this space, about history, about memory, about water. And, you know, I situate basing landscapes very much within the ongoing struggle that's taking place in the Philippines. Just because the base is left doesn't mean, you know, there isn't a whole culture of dependence in terms of the Philippines existing as a site of recreation and entertainment for US soldiers, because actually, even though those bases aren't there anymore, the equivalent of the number of soldiers, 15,000, that existed on the U.S. base now exist on submarines that move around the waters of the Philippines. A very strategic location in relation to China and all of the disputes happening in the South China Sea. But that kind of gendered violence that the women who had worked as prostitutes during the time of the U.S. bases were expressing hasn't stopped. And Jennifer Laudy, in 2014, was a transgendered woman who was killed by a U.S. soldier when he found out that she was transgendered. So this continues until the present. And again, I summon the way in which Saidiya Hartman asks us to think about the present, the history of the present, right, as one that is in continuity with the past and the future. Another project that I think is very much in dialogue with these legacies of imperialism and the visualities that they produced is White Gaze, which is a project I completed in 2017 in collaboration with Viet Le. And for the project, I worked with an archive of National Geographic magazines, which I found at a random estate sale in Altadena, California, and bought for $15 and put all of them into the back of my partner Camilo's red pickup truck, and we drove home, and they sat outside of my studio for a year because I had no idea what to do with them. But I knew there was something to be done with them, and when I finally gave myself the chance to start looking at them, I found myself attracted to the images where I actually saw, some index of the gaze that was looking at its others. And of course, when we think about, a representation of the world, there's no, I think, popular form that has captured, I think, a global imagination more strongly than National Geographic, whose inception at in the late 1890s was all about trying to capture the world, and its original, front page had the four cardinal points of the world, north, south, east, and west, as a kind of orientation for its table of contents, as if all of the contents was all of the world. So, I was looking through this archive of National Geographics and finding myself very attracted to images where, the form of looking was laid bare. And I gave myself a kind of, set of rules to work with. And that was work with the page and just subtract the text that was there on the page in order to create a different kind of meaning. I would say like a counterpoint to the meaning that was already being produced by the image-text relationship. So, flag of conquest, this one became, she was destroyed by U.S. Marine operators. Uncle Sam's territory, $8 million. American men look at the girl in the foreground. Black historians see him raking in the profits. No text. A wasteland for Western man. The camera may be a gun. Of course, I think that, National Geographic was also so much about photography. And again and again, this insinuation about camera and gun happens within the image and text relationship that I was running across. He shoots with either a gun or a camera. I became aware of quantities of equipment marked USA. They disappeared. They disappeared. Empire needs imagination to see the violent film. Seeking immortality. Far Eastern obsoletes. The conquest of the South, the end of history. Absence. And so, in closing, I'm going to return to an image that I introduced you to, which is this install shot of the projectors, the 10-slide projectors, which just today I saw is actually very similar to this absence image that I pulled from this National Geographic. And I'm going to close by sharing with you an excerpt from this latest project called The Archives Fold. I'm going to skip over this. Sorry, just realizing time is very short. In the Archives Fold, is organized as a correspondence between the dead and the yet to be born, between my great-great-grandmother in 1905 and my great-great-great-granddaughter in 2123, and both are named Latipa. And just as background, part of the whole reason why I started doing a lot of this colonial archival work is because I had heard all of these magical stories about my great-great-grandmother. And I wanted to write her story. But in order to do so, I felt like I just needed something to ground that. And I was looking for an image from around the time that she was alive at the turn of the century, which was also the time of the both Spanish occupation and U.S. occupation and some of the most horrific violences and massacres actually that took place. Part of some of what I skipped over was actually how the island that we're from in Mindanao was a testing ground for many of the forms of torture that exist until the present, for example, waterboarding, and that was documented in photographs. And so the Archives Fold is in a way working with all of that legacy, but doing so and narrating these colonial images through the voices of these two women from the past and the future of my life. And the future Latipa writes during a time when the earth has become uninhabitable. In an attempt to lower the earth's temperature, massive amounts of sulfuric gas have been thrown into the stratosphere to lower the earth's temperature, but it went too far in the other direction. The sun was blocked and introduced an epoch of total darkness. Latipa is on her way to Proxima b, which at 4.2 light years away is the closest planet to the Earth thought to be able to support life. So this is the backdrop of the correspondence that I'm going to share with you now. And I would just say that I think that this project is thinking through a practice of archival futurism. So it's working with archives and thinking about how archives are inextricable from the colonial violences that produced them, but also that there's a way to work with them as a realm of intimacy between the dead and the living and the still to be born, and that there's a way to work with them as invested in a larger project of liberation, invested in developing the fullest understanding of all of those who have been silenced or disappeared, all the while grappling with the loss and limits to this knowing. And for me, climate change, and in particular the kind of ecological disasters that over the course of my work in the Philippines that I've witnessed in terms of rivers turning to ruin because of the multinational mine that seeps its chemicals into the river, and that river is no longer able to support life, or the fact that low-lying regions like the Philippines will be the first to experience, the really devastating effects of climate change, which have already, of course, begun in terms of these major typhoons, right, that have hit so many areas of our world. For me, climate disaster is very present today, but in the very near future, that is linked with these legacies of imperialism. So, to end, I just want to share with you a brief excerpt. Okay. Dearest Apo, April 30, 1905. Dearest Apo, I received your message in a dream. I saw you move through darkness toward an elsewhere that I cannot even begin to fathom. I never left my province, and here you are, amongst the stars. When you close your eyes, you see images of the great beauty and radiance of the earth, along with images of the immense destruction and sadness. You tell me these images mean nothing to you. I understand. It was a naive scientist who thought that images alone were identical to memory, a naive scientist who didn't understand that the least important thing about an image is what it shows. It is said that the earth was very beautiful. Yes, it was beautiful, but also so very ugly. The words beautiful and ugly do not even begin to capture what would one day drive you, Apo, into deep time. The conditions of your journey were already in formation during my time. It's the same colonizing mind, again and again. I wonder now what I could have done to stop it. I cry for you just as the day I cried when 5 generations before my great-great-granddaughter left for America, and just as the day I shielded your grandmother from the harshness of the wind when she fled for the Corps. Apo, the images they have given you are a hall of mirrors. The archives you have access to are reflections of the same. They told you that they gave you all the images of the world, but that is their distorted vision. The images are just a piece of tape, and on the other side are worlds so much more vast than anything their archives could ever possibly contain. They want to imagine us dead. They are ignorant of the connection between the living and the dead. The world was never made of images. You write to me because you know this. This knowledge lives in your blood, the same way it lived in my granddaughter's blood when she would mediate between the worlds of the living and the dead, the same way it lived in her granddaughter's blood when storytelling became a bridge between the past, present, and future. My tears exist in the archive's folds. They send the image to its ruin. You are not looking for an image to live in, but for a memory that lives in your cells. It is memory that will sustain you in deep time. I am with you in this journey. Love, Ama. Thank you.